Hi guys, and welcome to History 240 again. So, couple things for housekeeping. So I looked over your discussions. Turns out that just barely the majority decided that they wanted to move due dates to Sunday instead of doing them on um, Fridays. So I've gone ahead and I have changed everything over to where everything is due on Sunday from now on. So if anything happens to disappear or not show up as the right due date, or you can't find something, just let me know. I don't know if I told you guys this or not, but I'm not super proficient at Blackboard. This is only my third semester using it, and so I'm still kind of trying to learn the ropes with it. So if you guys don't mind, if something disappears or you can't find it, just let me know. Send me an email, whatever. And I really should have taken you guys' busy lives, into account when I was setting these up, when I was setting up assignments. So I do have to apologize to you. In setting these up, I kind of only thought about myself with these. And I'm a graduate student this year, and I've got about 75 other students who I have to grade and, do those kinds of things with. So I was thinking that because of that, I was worried that I wouldn't get you guys your stuff back in a timely manner. So what I've kind of thought maybe will work in the meantime is for me to go ahead and tell you guys the caveat of all of this with the due date change. And first and foremost, I'm going to try to get you guys back all of your stuff within 1 week, just the same as it was before. But with the understanding that it may take me a little bit longer to get everything back, because normally I plan to do all of my grading on Saturdays and Sundays. So I'm going to continue to try to get all of that stuff back to you, but it just may take a little longer, so please just be patient with me. Beyond that, there were a couple of due dates that I couldn't change. So, for example, your final essay. I have somebody who's over my head who needs these back at a certain time, so unfortunately, I couldn't change that due date, and I couldn't change the due date for your final exam. But in exchange, what I've done is I have taken off all of the days that you guys maybe can't turn your stuff in by. So like they're supposed to disappear after a little bit so that you guys can't turn in stuff late. So what I've decided to do is that in exchange for the fact I couldn't change those dates, I'm going to take late submissions on everything except tests and the final essay paper. So with that, those are dates that I really can't change, unfortunately, so I apologize that I can't, help you guys out with that. But hopefully taking things late within reason, you guys will, be able to get some more points, and maybe that'll help you guys out just a little bit since I can't take the other things the way that, we would like to. So that being said, time to move on to history, which is the fun part, which is the best part. Yay, history. So hopefully during this time, what I'm hoping to do is to be able to incorporate some things maybe you guys haven't ever seen before, some things you've never heard of. I'm planning on starting this session in about the time Fort Boonesborough is established, and then moving on to the War of 1812. Now this is a huge chunk of history, and we're going to kind of try to get through it pretty quickly. So just hang on. This might take a little over an hour, but just hang in there. We'll get through it, and you guys only have, after this one, you guys have, I think, 2 weeks until your first test. So that's coming up fast. Go ahead and start studying, guys. If you guys are printing off, which you should be, your PowerPoints, make sure that you're marking people, places, and terms, because that's where all of your test questions are going to come from, is going to be people, places, and terms. So, age of exploration is a term. People, Simon Kenton, who we're going to cover today, is going to be a person. He may not necessarily be on the test, but he's a person, so you'll need to know him. Citizen gene is a term. Citizen gene affair, anyways. Citizen gene is, he's a person. Spain is a place. Portugal is a place. Hispaniola is a place. All of those key terms are going to be on your test, or they could potentially be on your test, so you guys need to study them. And what I recommend doing, and what I've done in the past, and granted it takes a long time, but if you really want to succeed on these tests, what you'll do is you'll make a list of all the people, all the places, all the terms, and you'll create definitions for them. And as you're creating definitions, you'll kind of be able to cross-study just a little bit. So if you're looking at Jamestown, you might put on there that it was the first colony, within the U.S. that was successful. Women were first brought there. Pocahontas is associated with it. John Rolfe is associated with it. Things like that. So just kind of keep that in mind, and you can kind of cross-study that way, and it'll help you guys to study for the other parts of your test while you're studying for one specific part of your test. So when I put your test on Blackboard here, it'll come up in the first section. You'll have all people, and then you'll have all places, and then you'll have all terms. And I'm planning on this being a multiple choice test, so hopefully that helps you guys out just a little bit. In my other courses, it's been matching. So this is going to be my first time doing a test over Blackboard. So hopefully all goes well, and hopefully there aren't any issues, but we'll figure it out as we go along. So with that, on to history! Yay! Now that we take care of all the housekeeping stuff. So with this, if you guys will turn to your first section, so we're going to talk about traveling in Kentucky first. So Kentucky is originally part of the Virginia colony. It is actually just a county within Virginia, which is why you see so many things associated with Virginia going on in Kentucky. And there are a couple of different ways into Kentucky. You can go through the Cumberland Gap, and you can go down through the rivers, like we kind of talked about last week. We also talked about hunters and frontiersmen and trappers and those kinds of folks being the first people who are Europeans who are traveling into Kentucky. Now, with that, I want to show you guys something neat, and it is how Europeans originally got to the U.S. So I'm going to run and grab something real quick. Hold on, okay? Okay, guys. So what I have here is called an indenture, and you can see that it says that right here, this indenture. So this is a really cool document. So indentures are the ways that your middle-class Europeans got over to the U.S. from mainly Great Britain. It is a British colony. So people are coming into Virginia, they're coming into Jamestown, they're coming into Philadelphia, they're coming in places where their families are. So this is essentially a document that says that someone will work for someone else in repayment for the debt of them crossing the Atlantic. So most of these people start out in England, like I said, and they will sign away 7 years of their life to work for somebody else. Generally, it's originally a ship's captain. So the ship's captain will sign off on a document, and they'll say, okay, I'll take this person aboard. And in exchange, they have to work for usually 7 to 14 years. Now, once they get over to the American colonies, that changes just a little bit. And either someone else will buy their indenture from the ship's captain and have them work 7 to 14 years on, say, a farm or in a factory or wherever it is that they can get them. Factories aren't really quite in yet. Most of the U.S. is rural areas, but there are things like logging going on and fishing and those kinds of things. So more industrial centers have not been established, per se. There are some textile mills going in England by this point, but there's not a whole lot of them in the United States. but as time goes on, they'll start ending up in those industrial centers like that. This indenture in particular, I think, is from 1677, I believe. And the neat thing about indentures is that they're essentially slave contracts. So a person works for a master for 7 to 14 years, and they have no choice in what their duties are. They have no choice in what they get when they're done. It's just that they end up saying, okay, well, here's a horse and a little bit of land, or here's some seed and a little bit of land, or here's some blacksmithing tools and a horse. Good luck to you. And if you survive, you'll get those after 7 to 14 years. Now, the caveat with that is that you had to be able to prove that your indenture was over. So the way that you did that is you have this kind of line that goes along the top of this indenture here, and you guys can see it's kind of squiggly. It's not a straight line. So what you had to do is you had to show this indenture to your indenture holder. And from there, they would put this up against their copy, which is a mirror copy of your indenture, which is this. And they would put it together, and they would just kind of hope to goodness that they lined up, because if they didn't line up, then you were stuck as an indentured servant indefinitely. Or they'd have to sign up a new contract from that point. So this indenture, most of these are fairly hard to read. This one is just a standard indenture, if I'm reading it correctly, that states that, they're just kind of coming over here. They haven't stipulated, what they get in return other than their transport to the U.S. Most of these documents are fairly standardized. All of them, practically all of them, say this indenture up here in the corner. Now, from there, you also have other pieces of history that are hooked on. So you've got over in this section right here, this is a paper stamp. So this was a tax that was on paper that the British would use for revenue. And then down here, you've also got, let me see, seals and names that are signed down here at the bottom. Now I have to apologize, I'm not in exactly the best position to show you guys this. I'm currently moving, so I'm sitting in the middle of the floor trying to get this document over to you. So you can kind of see this seal right here with this signature. Now, this would be the person who is usually a witness, and then you have the person who's associated with the contract, and then the person who is taking on the indentured servant. So this one has just the one signature on it, and it's got just the one seal on it. And I'm fairly certain that it is the person who is signing themselves into indenturement. So that is pretty cool. I've got about 5 of these, and every single one of them are different, and they're from different time periods. Generally, the ones that are larger are newer. The originals are fairly small. They tend to be about this big by about, let me see, getting the camera view, about this big. They're not huge. Most of them have the paper stamp on them. So, these stamps are, kind of associated with the Stamp Act later on for other things within the United States, and it's a contentious point between the U.S. colonies and the British coming up into the American Revolution. So with this, you guys can see how this could be used as a primary source document. This is created during and around the time of the American Revolution, and you can see how these pieces kind of add into the idea of cheap labor coming to the United States and using the United States as revenue and things like that. So you can see how this would be a primary source document. It's something created during the time we're discussing, and we're using it to make assumptions about history and about the lives of these people. So, going back to our talks about Kentucky, several of the people who are coming into Kentucky are, they're either indentured servants, they're slaves, They come from all kinds of backgrounds, and many of the hunters and the frontiersmen are people who, they maybe have run away from their indenturements, those kinds of things, and so they come from very varied backgrounds. Um, and we're going to talk about some kind of colorful characters in just a few minutes as we go along. So, appeals for Kentucky. Kentucky is relatively flat once you get through the Appalachians. It's a beautiful, beautiful land. There's lots of resources, and there's food everywhere. Elk, buffalo, deer, squirrels, pigeons, you name it, Kentucky's got it. So, keep that in mind as you're trying to figure out why exactly people are risking their lives to get into Kentucky. Um, and with this risking of their lives, it kind of brings in the idea of, well, why are they risking their lives, or what's so risky for them? Travel into Kentucky is extremely slow. So, granted, the geography is, fairly nice in some respects. You have the Cumberland Gap that we talked about last week, and you've got the Ohio River, which is super helpful in getting into Kentucky faster, and then going down the Kentucky River, helping to get there a little faster. But, other things are kind of standing in the way. And so people will kind of slowly trickle into Kentucky as time goes on. Native Americans are one of the largest reasons why people aren't, just kind of coming wholesale into Kentucky. The Appalachian Mountains are one of the reasons why they're not coming just, from all over. Mostly they're coming in from Pennsylvania down the Ohio, or from Virginia and North Carolina through the Cumberland Gap. Um, and then they really just don't have any good reason to come. There's plenty of land at this point east of the Appalachian Mountains. So they really don't have a particularly good reason to come this way. But as those land resources kind of shrivel, then more people are going to come into Kentucky. And then there's a little bit of land dispute. Whose land is it? Is it Native American land? Is it the land of the English? Is it the land of the French? Whose land is it? And so, it's kind of a contentious point for them. But regardless, Kentucky County within Virginia is established in October of 1776. And it ends up being divided into 3 counties around November of 1780. It becomes Jefferson County, Fayette County, and Lincoln County within Virginia. So, moving on from there, I'm going to tell you guys about a couple of interesting characters throughout history and some early frontiersmen. So, Daniel Boone, who we talked a little bit about last week with the Transylvania scheme. I'm going to give you a little bit more about him. So, Daniel Boone was born 1734. He lives until 1820. He's a hunter and he's a trapper, and those are his primary occupations. He finds the Cumberland Gap, he creates the Wilderness Road, and he's part of the Transylvania Company. Now, something about Daniel Boone is that the majority of his children die in their travels coming into Kentucky. But Kentucky is such a lush and fertile land, and the revenues are so good that people are willing to risk coming back and risk losing their lives and the lives of their families in order to, kind of colonize this land and make this land profitable for them. He loses one child when he comes in to get Herod. He ends up losing another one at the Battle of Blue Licks. He's got a daughter who gets kidnapped by Native Americans, and he ends up going into Ohio to save her. And then he gets captured another time by Native Americans, and he ends up coming back to Fort Boonesborough with just enough time to save Fort Boonesborough from being attacked. So, throughout this time, he's got some fairly dangerous encounters. And he continues his entire life going through these dangerous encounters. And at the point where Kentucky starts becoming slightly more civilized, he ends up moving into Missouri. Now, somebody else you guys may have heard of is Simon Kenton. And Simon Kenton is famous from a book that, honestly, the name of it escapes me right now. But he was a fairly obscure trapper and hunter from about 1775 to 1783. And he becomes prevalent because of this book. And if you guys happen to remember the name of the book, or you know which book I'm talking about, it's a Alan Eckert book. The Frontiersman, actually, is what it's called. I remembered. The Frontiersman is what it's called. And with this book, he becomes a prominent frontiersman. So, that's one thing that you guys should probably consider about history. Going to go down a little rabbit hole here. But history that we study is based off of what survives. And so for our generation, what has survived has been some information about Simon Kenton. He was a completely obscure frontiersman until Alan Eckert sat down and wrote down his history, and now he's a well-known frontiersman. I don't get the idea that he was particularly well-liked or that he was particularly well-known even then, but he becomes that way because we have documents that prove his existence. So just a little bit more about Simon Kenton. So he is from a little town called Farquhar, Virginia. I think I'm saying that correctly. But he gets in a fight with a girl. And so he flees from there to West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. And he spends his time out in the wilderness under a different name because he's afraid that he's killed a man, and he's fighting over a girl when he's 16. But he travels as Simon Butler under a completely different name because he doesn't want anybody to know who he is in case he killed that man, and he doesn't want to get taken back and thrown in jail and charged with murder. Turns out the guy lived, and so he kind of takes that name back of Simon Kenton after he finds out that this guy's still alive. But from then on, he's a little bit more sober in his actions. He ends up being a scout, a soldier, and a frontiersman, trapper, hunter. He ends up saving Daniel Boone's life at one point. And then he is also captured by Native Americans and nearly killed. And he's run through the gauntlet, which is kind of a Native American ritual for those who are not part of their tribe. They're the enemy, and it's a way of kind of punishing them. But he ends up surviving running through the gauntlet, and he's adopted into the tribe. And if you guys want to learn more about that, you should absolutely read The Frontiersman. It's a fantastic book. It's super dense, but it's got a lot of good information to it. And I'm told, but I cannot say with certainty, that it gets really kind of interesting after about page 400. So you've got a whole lot of lead up to about page 400, and then from there it gets super interesting. But moving on from that, he goes on Native American attacks. So there's a guy named George Rogers Clark, who we'll learn about a little bit more as we talk about statehood and those kinds of things. And George Rogers Clark is well known for attacking Native American settlements and taking those settlements and just completely obliterating everyone who's inside them. So he will wait until the warriors will go off or they'll go hunting, and then he would go in and he would attack these places, kill women, children. Absolutely brutal. But Simon Kenton tends to go with him on a lot of these Native American attacks, and helps to kind of decimate the population of Native Americans in Kentucky and Ohio. And he ends up settling in Ohio in about 1810. but he serves in the militia for the War of 1812. So just giving you a little bit of background about him. So let's move on to the Battle of Blue Licks. Now, this is considered to be the last battle of the Revolutionary War, and it's really the only part of the Revolutionary War that Kentuckians are really involved in. And what's going on here is that at this point, we talked about salt a little bit earlier in this course, and how hard it is to get your hands on salt. So there is something called a salt lick, and it is a place where a spring that naturally has salt in it is coming out of the ground, or it's where a chunk of salt is, and animal paths have gone up to these. And in this case, at Blue Licks, there's a buffalo trace or a buffalo trail that leads to this salt lick. So, following the siege of Bryan Station in August of 1782, a group of Kentuckians have gone up, and the Bryan Station is completely out of materials and salt, and they're desperate for salt and other goods. And so Boone, who is part of the militia, goes up and kind of helps to alleviate some of the pressures from both the British and the Native Americans. Now, the British, who are led by Captain William Caldwell and Alexander McKee, are laying in ambush right outside Bryan Station. And Boone, who is coming down from Blue Licks, and you can very obviously see the trail that these are coming from if you ever get the chance to stop at Blue Licks here in Kentucky. It's not far from Lexington, so if you ever get the chance to stop, you really should. But Boone is standing there, and he's looking around. And, you know, Boone's a trapper. He is a huntsman. He's super familiar with the woods. And he's just kind of looking around, and he's going, there's something going on here. I'm not comfortable with this. And he looks around, and he says, there's going to be an ambush here. We shouldn't go here. We need to find someplace else. We should turn around and go back. Well, a fella named Hugh McGarry says to him, them that ain't cowards, follow me. And so he leads this group of men who've come out of Bryan Station and the surrounding areas. He leads them down this little path going towards the salt lick. And Boone looks around at everyone around him, and he says, we are all slaughtered men. And so you can kind of get this feeling for the danger that's really, truly associated here. And many, many men died, including Boone's son. You know, there are a couple of instances of, you know, great bravery in this encounter, where one soldier gives his personal horse to a leader, a commander, and says, take my horse and go. He ends up dying, but, you know, the commander makes it out. Daniel Boone's son dies. Daniel Boone watches his son die, and then I think he ends up taking his horse and riding off after his son has died. So, you know, there are all of these instances in which, you know, Americans really have the chance to come through as heroes, but, you know, this is one of those instances where it's not come through as clearly, and where the British really get the upper hand on the Americans at this point. But in retaliation for this, the Americans, the colonists, go and they destroy 5 Shawnee towns. Now, there's no evidence that we have found that says that those Shawnee villages were even associated with this encounter in particular. But it didn't matter. It was the fact that they were Native Americans. It's them versus us. They're siding with the British. We're Americans, so we're going to slaughter everyone in these villages. in order to get back at them for what happened and for our deaths that happened at Blue Licks. It was a kind of a tragic encounter, but it kind of gives you an idea for the mentality that's going on in that kind of polarization, both politically and geographically, between not only the Americans and the British, but the Americans and the Native Americans. You can really see the tensions building between these nations, and the idea of my enemy's enemy is my friend is really playing into the hands of the British at this point. Because the Native Americans don't see the British, who are all the way across the ocean, as being as big of a threat as those who are sitting in their backyard as American colonists and who are coming over in droves into the lands that they have held and that are essentially their property, but they don't necessarily call it property, but the lands that are native to them. And so, you guys can kind of see that real polarization and the real danger associated with this. Native Americans are packing people off left and right. They're killing people left and right, but Americans are killing just as many, if not more, of them. And that's not only from their battles and their encounters, but it's from disease. It's from all kinds of things. It's from denying them resources. All of these things are kind of moving together to, decimate the Native American populations in the U.S. at this point. So just keep this in mind as we go through this semester. I'm thinking about showing a video from, a Native American point of view regarding the Old West and that kind of stuff. I haven't decided exactly if I'm going to do that or not yet, but I just want you guys to keep this in mind, that this is a long-standing tradition within the United States. So just keep that in mind. Now, as we go on, we're going to talk about statehood. Now, you have George Rogers Clark, who is a very prominent member of Kentucky society. He's the highest ranking officer in the Northeast. He's a part of the Kentucky militia, and he helps to forge the identity of Kentucky as its own state. He really leads the way for Kentucky to be adopted into the Union as a separate state and not part of Virginia. So in 1792, Kentucky is admitted to the Union, which means it becomes its own state. And it creates a governing document called the Bill Providing for Kentucky Statehood. And that's what they use to appeal to Congress to say, okay, I'm applying for statehood. This is what we want. These are our terms. This is our population, those kinds of things. And they accept it. So then after that, they have to create a governing document. They have to figure out who's going to be the governor, who's going to be the leader, what their state is going to look like in terms of government. And they end up electing a man named Isaac Shelby, who is associated in Lord Dunmore's War, which is a Virginia border war with some Native Americans. He's part of the Kentucky militia. And he was a surveyor for the Transylvania Company, the same Transylvania Company that had the Transylvania Scheme. Same group. And he was a politician within the House of Delegates, which is the governing houses of Virginia, one of the governing houses of Virginia. So he's got a military background. He's got a political background. He's got a background of knowing the state, from a very hands-on level. He's got all of this kind of setting in his favor. So he's really the ideal candidate for the first governor of Kentucky. So they set up their temporary capital in Lexington. But they end up settling permanently in Frankfort because Frankfort made an offer for becoming the new capital. Every little town had to, submit a proposal to become the capital. And so Frankfurt offered not only land, but building material, money, glass, nails, timber, stone, locks, all kinds of things. And it was something that at the time Lexington just really couldn't keep up with. So that's why Frankfurt is the capital instead of Lexington, even though Lexington is a larger town. So as far as government structure goes, Kentucky goes through 4 different sets of constitutions. The first one is in 1792. From there, another constitution was written in 1799. Then another one was written in 1850. And then finally another one was written in 1891. And from the 1891 document, they've gone back and they've just kind of edited it through amendments. So each part of the government structure, there are 3 main parts, and it functions exactly like it does on the federal level. So you'll have the executive, which is made up of the governor and his chief administration. Then you have the judicial, which is made up of the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, the Circuit Court, and the District Court, going from highest being the Supreme Court and the lowest being the district courts. And then you have, of course, the legislative branch, which is made up of a General Assembly that has 38 senators and 100 representatives. Okay? So from there, the governor is the commander-in-chief for the state. He makes appointments. Which appointments being not like I've got tea at 2 o'clock, it's more like government appointments. So he gets to choose who gets to be in what office. He can give out punishments. He can give out commutations, which is kind of like giving a lesser sentence. And he has all kinds of options for what he can do within his state. So if that makes any sense whatsoever. So moving on from there, we're going to talk a little bit more about Isaac Shelby. Now, as you guys can see, Isaac Shelby's, fairly important and prominent person within Kentucky, and he ends up, gaining popularity as time goes on. So in his first term, his goal is mainly to protect the frontiers, protect those who are in the frontiers, to kind of solidify his standing and Kentucky's standing within the United States. And he has an undeclared war against the Native Americans who are there in the area. And so he tends to be battling these Native Americans a lot. He's finding things that are normally associated with the British in possession of some of the Native Americans. And so he is really suspicious of Native American involvement. And so he says, I'm going to get some folks together and I'm going to take care of this British issue. And so he and a man named General Mad Anthony Wayne meet at Fort Washington in Cincinnati. And this leads to the Northwest Indian War. And when this happens, he recruits, actually conscribes about 1,000 troops from within Kentucky to take into the Northwest Territory in order to kind of battle against the Native American forces there. And he has until winter to get this done. And then from there, he also wants to make safer trade within the Mississippi. So as you guys know, Kentucky has one border that it leads up to the Mississippi. And it is a huge trading area for Kentucky. And granted, not all of Kentucky is fully settled here, but it's how they get into the Ohio River from the Mississippi, and then they can trade down into Kentucky from the Mississippi. So the more secure they can make that area, the better off they are. And then from there, Isaac Shelby goes on to create basic laws and tax structures. He's also involved in the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August of 1794. It's the final battle for the Northwest Territory, which, if you look at this map down here at the bottom of the slide, you can see the Northwest Territory. It ends up being present-day Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. And the way that it's put together is fairly interesting. They have a way of rewarding those who've been members of the Revolutionary War and the fighting within the Revolutionary War. So what they're doing is they're taking those who fought in lieu of cash payment. They're giving them land within this territory, and what they'll do is they'll take and put a military member in a county or a captain within a county, and then they will fill up the rest of that county within the Northwest Territory. And eventually they fill up Ohio, and then they kind of move on from there. But anyways, back to the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It's, like I said, the last battle for the Northwest Territory, and this is against the Northwest Indian Confederation. And this takes place, of course, during the Northwest Indian War. There's a lot of Indian wars that are going on here at this time, but the Northwest Indian War is particularly prominent in this area during the time that Isaac Shelby is in power. And it's from 1785 to 1795. So from there, to try to make peace, this territory is part of the Treaty of Paris during the Revolutionary War, and it's given over to the U.S. In the Treaty of Paris. But this Native American Confederacy does not agree to the Treaty of Paris, so they don't feel like they need to give this land up, and that is really what spurs on the Northwest Indian War. So from there, this Northwestern Confederacy in Great Britain start having battles again with the United States. And at a certain point in August of 1795, they signed the Treaty of Greenville, which says that they will establish a line that U.S. settlers cannot cross, and the rest of it is in Indian territory, and we will not cross that line. And so they attempt to make peace, but not in reality, because that isn't what happens. People from within Ohio just keep encroaching on that Native American territory, and they keep encroaching, and they keep encroaching, and it doesn't stop. So, you can see how this is one of those trends where, there's a very strong boundary, and at least for the Native Americans, and the U.S. is just kind of saying, screw it, I'm going to go ahead over anyway. No big deal. They're just dirty Native Americans. And so you can see why there's increasing tension that leads up to further encounters and further issues with Native Americans. So, moving on from here. This is really where we get into the issues with the Citizen Genet affair that I had mentioned earlier. So, under James Garrard, who's a really, really prominent Kentuckian, we encounter something called the Citizen Genet affair. Now, Citizen Genet is actually named Edward Charles Genet. And his whole thought, and even coming to the United States, is to endanger stability between the U.S. and Spain. Because Spain has some holdings that are close to other French holdings, and Citizen Genet, or Edward Charles, is French. So, the U.S. Signs a neutrality proclamation in April of 1793, but the reason why Kentucky gets called into this is that, Kentucky ends up butting up against a Spanish border in some ways and having some contact with Spain in several ways, especially in the South. So a couple of Citizen Genet's buddies come into Kentucky, and they're like, oh, hey, you guys should totally go check out those Spanish holdings because they look fabulous and you should really take them. And they are eventually recalled back over to France, mainly by the efforts of Girard and his associates, kind of saying, okay, whoa, wait a second, this isn't okay. We're going to tell the president about this, and we'll talk about that later. So they end up being recalled back to France. But Genet does not end up going back, because if he had gone back, a group called the Jacobins would have likely chopped his head off, because at about this same time you see the French Revolution going on and the Reign of Terror and the guillotine, all of the things that most people associate with the French Revolution is happening at this time. So just kind of keep that in mind. But Girard is going in for 2 terms between 1796 and 1804. And at this time, there's a whole lot of political polarization between whether or not to have any kind of separation or whether to allow slavery in the Constitution. This is already an issue during the time between 1796 and 1804. This is more than 50 years prior to the Civil War. There are everywhere issues of whether or not to allow slavery in the United States. This is one of the primary discussions for the U.S. Constitution for the whole country, let alone to have these kinds of issues come up in statewide elections. But the federal government just kind of says, we'll let you guys decide, but we'll allow it. We'll allow slaves to exist for a little while. So they go on to allow slavery within Kentucky from there.